Greetings, productive programmers. So in this lesson, we are going to take a look at how to store those user IDs for our logged in users to our stories when we hit the save button, either on a new one, and when we're editing one, it should already be saved at that point, so that'll be fine. But when we create a new story, we need to associate it with a user. So again, you can see that here in the database because the user IDs are blank when we save. So we're going to change it so that way when new records get saved into the database here, it'll display the user's ID. And if I do select everything from the users table, you can see here are the users that I've created so far. So it should insert the user ID of 1 or the user ID of 2 here, depending on which user saves it. Okay, so the way that we execute this, if we look briefly, we can see that the user auth here, this controls the required authenticated user route. So if we come in here and we find this, we'll see that the connection is check-in to see if there's a current user. So that's how the authentication works. So we actually already have the current user stored inside of the socket assigns variables. So we can just take advantage of this to figure out who the user is. So you can see that this current user here, so the way that this gets assigned here is our user auth module here. This is taking care of all the complexity for us. When we used our auth generator, it set up this entire file for us and it takes care of all that complexity. So the current user, if we look through the code here, we can see that when a user is logged in, it mounts the current user, so it assigns to the socket the current user. So it stores all of this stuff for us and it assigns it to the socket, so that way we don't have to really do any of this stuff manually. So we really get to just take advantage of the current user that's logged in without having to do any additional work. Another excellent reason why Phoenix LiveView is so productive. So let's go ahead, if we go into where we have our stories now that are being generated, which create the stories when we click New Story. Those are living inside of our Story Live area. And that's where we were looking at the form component before. I just want to show you, for example, what these files are. So let's get a fresh start here. This live folder has our Story Live endpoints. And the form component we looked at briefly, that's the form that pops up here. And we have the index.ex. This handles listing out all of the stories here on this stories endpoint. So it lists all of these stories here. And then we have the show endpoint as well. And this is if we come into one of these stories, if we click into them and we were to look at the individual story by basically just clicking on anywhere in this list here, other than the edit and delete section. So it opens up this endpoint here. So all of this code inside the story_live was generated for us by our gen live generator. So when we created our stories endpoint using that generator command, all of these were created for us. So again, that was the gen.live command that we ran. It was the one that we did after we set up the authentication. So we're going to modify some stuff in here, but I just want to show you first that the socket that we were talking about, the current user is assigned to the socket. And the way that we can do that is I'll just very quickly require our logger here inside of our index.ex file. And what I'll do is I'll log out that information that's stored inside the socket. So I'll do logger.info and I'll say current user is, and then I will take a peek at what's inside of our socket.assigns. And we will take a look at our current user. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and let's open up the terminal so we can watch this in real time. And let's go ahead and come over here. I'll just put some spaces so you can see when new code is logged here that it will be clearly separated from our previous endpoints being hit. So if I come back over here and I refresh this page just got loaded again. This index.ex file that lists out all of our stories here just got loaded again. So if we come in here where this endpoint was hit and we look through here, we should be able to find our logger. And let's see, here it is. So it says info current user is, that's the one that we just entered. So that's the value that we just entered here with logger.info. So current user is, and then it's printing out the user struct. So this user struct, we can investigate this further, and we just want the user ID. So let's just do .id because I don't need the entire user. I just need the user ID. So I'm going to do that, resave it, separate it out from our previous endpoints being hit. Come over here. Let's refresh this page again. And now we should see that the current user is 1. So now we have the value that we need. So we are going to use the user's ID to store that inside of our blog stories here. Okay, so to take advantage of this current user, the index.ex is our module that's going to mount our heeks file for the index. That's going to be this index.html.heeks. If you took the fundamentals crash course that I teach, then you should be familiar with this to a certain degree already. But this is going to be the file that gets loaded when we come to this endpoint here. So again, if you're not sure how this file is loaded, you should take my crash course because I already explained that. So, but you can see very briefly, just so you feel comfortable here, these routes in our router. This is our stories endpoint is loading our story live index, which is that index.ex file. And anytime we have a file that's structured like this, it's going to look in the same directory. And if we're mounting the file and we don't have like a def render, then the alternative to a def render is that it will, by default, Phoenix LiveView will go ahead and load the file with the same name that has the extension .html.heeks. So in this case, our index.ex will associate with the index.html.heeks. And that is true for any of these. So show.ex relates to the show.html.heeks. So I won't explain that again, but you should just be aware of that because it's good to know. And if you took my crash course, that should already be familiar a little bit. Maybe it's worth just doing that refresher though, in case you needed a little refresher on that, because it's always good to drill those concepts into your head and understand the fundamental concepts of Phoenix LiveView. All right, but now that you understand that, we are going to need to take that current user and use it inside of our forms. So these forms that pop up when we click New Story, we need to associate the user ID there when we save it, that user ID that we just console logged out. Now that form component, that is form_component.ex, you can see that inside of our index.html heeks, we load it inside the live component here. You can see that we have a live component and it loads that module. This was all generated for us again by the live generator that we utilized in our previous lesson. But this form component on its own currently does not have information about the current user. So we cannot locate the current user in here. What we can do is we can go into our live component and we can add that information in here. So if we come to where the save event happens inside of our form component, the save event is what's going to be triggered anytime we click Save Story. So what we can do is we can just go ahead, and I want to show you that if we were to do logger.info and we were to say current user from form component, and I'm making these very descriptive names for teaching purposes, just so it's very clear that this is going to be the area of the code that's being executed when you see this console log in our terminal after. And I'm going to do the same thing that we did before from the index.html, and I am going to output this right here. And I want you to take a look at something interesting. This wasn't the interesting part, but we do have to require the logger again. That's why that line was all yellow. So just make sure that we require that so that the logger will be available here when we save. Okay, so now that we have this, let's go ahead, make our terminal a little bit bigger. I'm adding some spaces just to separate our code. We are going to execute a saving here. So this is going to be a new save, and we are going to click Save Info, and our code kind of broke. You can see that it didn't load correctly. We come back here, and we see that key ID not found in nil. In other words, this current user This value is not set here. So if I didn't do .id, if I just did this, it would still complain and say that that was nil, which is basically like none. There's no object that exists here. Nil is essentially like null in other programming languages. So it is nil, it is not there, it does not exist. And so why is that? Well, we need to also send this assignment over to the form component because it's available inside the index.html, the index.ex file when we execute it here. But when we went ahead and passed and set up our form component here, you can see that we pass all of this information in, and we need to also pass in our user. So what I'm going to do right here, I'm going to include the user ID, and I'm going to set that to be the current user, and I just want the ID. So because it is available inside of our index.ex, because it's loaded for us, because this is the endpoint that our router routes to. So our router here requires the authentication. So it's going to mount the current user and it's going to pass it to the index.ex file. It's going to be available here, but it's not going to just, it's not going to forward that to our form component by default. So you have to be explicit about the information that you want to share with other components. And that ensures that you have a very lightweight application that doesn't just send a bunch of bloat around in your application, right? So we need to pass that current user, and anything that's available in the index.ex here will be available in our index.html heeks file. So our current user is accessible in this scope, but it's only going to be accessible inside of our form component if we pass it to it by adding this line here. And so let's go ahead and let's add that line. And now if we come back to our form component, so I'm going to rename this to current user from form component. I'm going to call this attempt 2, just to make sure that this is explicitly clear that this is a new attempt. And what I will do is I will go ahead and fix this. So we map the current user's ID to user ID. And so this will now be available in the form component, but only if we go ahead inside of our form component and change the sockets assign. Instead of current user, we have named this user underscore ID. We could have named this anything, but we named it user underscore ID. So we need it to match here inside the new sockets assign. And we won't need this .id here because we are just going very straightforward and just saving the ID. So we remove the bloat. We don't need to pass the entire user object, or the user struct, I should say, to the form component. All we need to know is the ID, because that's how we're going to build these relationships between our stories. We're going to have our stories here be assigned to just a user ID. And each user ID is going to be unique, so that will work out perfectly. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's check to see how attempt 2 looks. So let's add some spaces here just to make it clear to separate our previous terminal logs. And let's go ahead and create a new story. So I'm going to call this attempt 2, and I'm going to set another test here, and we will click save story. We can see that it says story created successfully. And when we come back to our terminal, we can see that it says current user from form component attempt 2 has the value 1, which we know is our user ID that has been passed here to the form component. So this is very good. We now can access the user ID variable inside of our socket assigns. And we did that by passing the current user's ID to the form component as user underscore ID. But if we look at Postgres and we go ahead and we grab the latest information from our stories, we can see that attempt 2 still does not have the user ID. And that's because we did not save it with the story yet. We have only made it accessible in our form component, and we still have to do the final step to save it to our stories, right? Because this is just a logger, right? It doesn't just automatically save that to our database. So if you remember, when it comes to saving things in our Ecto lessons previously in this course, the way that we do that is with a change set. So let's go ahead and let's quickly navigate to our lib blog, and let's go down to where we have our stories, story.ex. So in this module, we have our change set, which stores the body and it stores the title here in our change set. And we do have the user ID. So if we want to save the user ID to this story, so if you remember in our previous lesson with Ecto, we need to make that available in the change set. Otherwise, by default, Ecto will just ignore the new values. So we are going to set this up as an atom with the colons in front of it, and we're going to pass our user ID into our change set now. So that way we can save the user IDs to our database tables. So we're going to update the change set. And then after we have that available at our disposal, we will go ahead and modify this code here that we have inside the form component where we have the handle event save. So this is pretty close to what we need, but we have to make sure that the user ID gets set into the story params. So let's just do a quick interlude to talk about how all of this information is flowing here. So this is, there's quite a bit happening here, but Phoenix LiveView, our live generators, created all of this code essentially for us by default. So it's really efficient and it makes our jobs really easy, but it might also obscure how things are functioning here off the bat. So let's just take a quick look at how everything is structured. And if we look here, the save event, which is when we click the save button here, when we click save story, it triggers this handle event save. And this handle event save ends up passing all of the story params data, which is going to essentially be the blog title and the blog body. And what we want to do is we want this stories params to also include the user ID. So this story params, if we can actually quickly take a look at that if we want as well. So let me just log that out. And we'll just call this our story params, and I'll put that here. And then I will go ahead and log this out by saving another story. So just an example. And let's click example. This is going to be body. This is going to be example of the title. And let's click save. And then if we come here and we look at our terminal, you will see that it says story params, and it shows that there's the body here and there's the title. So when our form saves, it saves essentially that stuff as the story params. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that our user ID is also inside of the stories params. And so if we include that user ID inside of our story params, then this information will essentially flow down to where we have our code in our stories. And we've just included the change set to include the user ID. And it will ensure that that value gets stored into the database. And to just quickly cover that flow essentially, after our save event gets triggered, our story params you can see are being passed to the save story function, which handles either an edit or it handles a new story. In our case, the new story triggers create story, which is inside of our stories context. So if we go into here, we can see that there's a function that is set up for us by our live generators already that handles creating the story. And you can see all it does, the create story here inside of our stories module, it just goes ahead and it calls that story that we just edited here. All it does, you can see the create story call, it calls story, which is what we just edited here to include the user ID and the change set. So it's going to pass all of the parameters here to the change set and then insert them into the database. So because we've made it now available in the change set, we can successfully save as long as the user ID is available. So now we need to make the user ID available. So what we'll do inside of our form component here, so what we can do now inside of our form component is where we have the user ID here, we're just going to map it to our story params. So I will go ahead and I will do story params and I will map them so that we we'll put the user ID into the story params. So we're going to put into our story params here the user, we're going to call it user ID. So we're just going to keep the name and structure, and we will pass it our socket assigns user ID. So what that does is it updates the story params to essentially, instead of just having the body and the title, it will now include a third parameter, which will be that user ID when we save this. So let me go ahead and move this info logger down here. So story params after updating, that's for lack of a better term. And we will be able to log that information now. And I will go ahead and delete the logger that's taken place for the user ID. So let's go ahead and add some spaces here so it's very clear this new attempt that we make. And I'm going to come over here, create a new story, and I'm going to say, is the user ID saved now? Let's see. And we'll hit save story. It says story created successfully. We come over here to our terminal. It says story params after updating. We can see there's a body, and then we can see there's a title, and we can see that there's a user ID. Great. So let's go ahead and take a look at our database one more time. We are going to select all the stories, and finally, inside of our table, we have, is the user ID saved now? Let's see, and we can see the user ID 1 is now saved here. Okay, so great. We now have our user IDs functioning correctly. So let's just quickly recap. Let's do a quick summary of what we just did, because it was a lot of information to do a pretty essential component for our application. I want to make sure that you fully understand this. So I'm going to do a quick recap. I'm going to discuss this again and trace through what we did. And then I'll talk about what we need to do next. So, okay, so what did we do? So let's take a look at this. We have, again, taking the user ID that is by default available to us whenever our authentication endpoints are hit. So I'm going to go through this again high level one more time. Our request comes to our router that requires the authenticated user. The requiring of authenticated user, this function, as I showed before, it automatically will set up and assign a current user to the socket, and it will pass that down here to all of these routes. So our index route will now have that information, which is why we're able to console log the current user directly here. So Adam current user, and then we can also grab the individual values off of that user. And then from there, we just take that value, and inside of our index.html heeks, we pass it to the form component, and we remapped it to the value user_ID. And then inside of our form component, we were able to access that in the socket assigns, and we were able to then map that to our story params variable that then gets passed to the save functions of our stories. And that create story request will go down to our story module, which has all of our ecto schema and our ecto change set, which we added to include the user ID and inside of the change set. So whenever we make a save, it'll save that user ID. As you work with Phoenix LiveView more and more, you'll become more comfortable kind of following this logic out. So they've really broken apart the logic into chunks, so that way it kind of separates the responsibility and concerns of the application. So that way you have one place specifically, such as our story, specifically responsible for the story's schema and the change set that we're going to use. And this is all information that we acquired from the ecto portion of this course. And then we have another area that is the stories module, which is it's essentially the story's context. That's how we refer to it. So you can see here it says the story's context, and that handles making all of the actions on our database. So it'll use the story module essentially, but it'll do it as a kind of an intermediary step to handle all of the functions such as list in stories and get in stories and create in stories and update and delete in stories. It'll handle making all of those. This is where all of that code will be stored. All of the logic that interacts with the database essentially will be stored here. and then it'll make use of our story schema and our story change set. So there's just a separation of concerns. So don't be intimidated by this. Just think of it like Phoenix LiveView has basically broken up, which modules are responsible for which actions, and it helps keep our code clean. Although it does require us to kind of edit the files in a couple of different places, the more you work with Phoenix LiveView, the more you become comfortable with this. And again, it's not as complex as you think, although the first time you're trying to trace through the logic, it can be a little bit of a lot of information all at once. But you can see how the information flows here. It flows very straightforward and it's very logical. And once we follow all that logic through, we can see that it will pass the user ID down into our database and make it save successfully. So congratulations, you now have your user ID being stored with your stories table. So the next step, though, is to ensure that we start respecting that value, because now these stories actually save the user ID. So we can now say, woohoo, this works. And if I go back to our database here and I make another query, you can see, woohoo, this works. And it's still assigned to our user ID because we did that when we created the user. So we don't have to resave the user ID every time that we edit the file. That's why we only have to put it inside the handle event save. But I just wanted to emphasize that this is congratulations, you have this working now. And so what we can do from this point is we can move forward and we can say, how do we use this user ID to make our application respect it? Because right now, test@test.com can see this one that was, so let me just say, this was created by user ID 1. And if I was to log out here and log in as a new user, then when I go to the stories endpoint, you can see that I can still see the user ID 1 story. And my user ID for the new test user, if I come into our database and I select all of the users, then we can see that the new @test.com user has an ID of 3, and they can see user ID 1's values. So, and they can also edit it. So I can come in here and I can edit as user ID 3. So we need to make our database respect that, so that way we cannot edit other people's posts essentially. We don't want to allow user 3 to edit user 1's posts. So in the next lesson, we are going to continue this journey and we're going to see how we can start filtering data and respecting the users that are assigned here. So although we have authentication working, that is different than authorization. So user 3 should not be authorized to change user 1's post, but you can see that we clearly just did it, and I can even delete that user's post now. So that's a big problem. We need to respect the authorization. But now that we are saving the user ID into the database, we can finally move on to those steps of respecting the user that edited the story. So we're going to go ahead and I'll see you over in the next lesson where we will implement that functionality into our medium.com like clone. All right, I'll see you over there.